All right, good morning. Come in, take a seat. Good morning, good morning. Welcome to the first art lecture for the year. Yay, we're back. I'm Shaw Osha. I teach visual art and visual studies, and I'm teaching a program with Evan Blackwell called Studio Projects. And what I'd like to say about the art lecture series, for those of you who have not been here, is that we are interested in bringing a broad range of interdisciplinary approaches to contemporary art issues. So we might have writers, we might have artists, we might have activists, we might have scholars. And this idea of the diversity of practice, some of these practices are quite interdisciplinary. And the areas of inquiry and creative production also are quite diverse. And because we're way out in the woods at the bottom of the Puget Sound, to bring people to this campus to circulate, to have these tides come through is very important, I think, for us. The lectures are held every other Wednesday, so weeks 2, 4, 6, and 8, 11:30 to 1 here. They're all free and they're open to the public, so if you know people that are not Evergreen students or students that are not in programs that come to the series, please invite them. We also hope for this to be a live experience rather than one that's mediated. So we have a relationship with audience and speaker. That means there's room for discussion. The first hour is the presentation generally, although sometimes the speakers get very excited and go into the second half hour. The second half hour is a time for you all to ask questions. And it's very important that you all participate and engage with the speaker. It's kind of lonely up here. And so this should be a back and forth exchange of ideas. I'm interested in knowing what programs are in the room, so if the faculty would stand and introduce yourselves and the name of your program and its field of study or combined fields of studies.
I'm Julia Zay. I'm Surrey Peruvian, and we're teaching media work.
My name is Amjad Kaur. I'm teaching a program called Image Supremacy. So, upper level, intermediate to upper level photography program.
Is Sassoon? Oh, there.
I teach competency the road to an excellent photography.
I'm Julia Hynexius, and I'm teaching with Eric Stein in Life with Things.
And what are the fields?
My fields?
You and Eric. What?
Anthropology, cultural anthropology, and 3D art, fine metal smithing.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'm Bob Leverich. I'm teaching SOS 3D sculpture and furniture. We have about 10 students doing advanced projects in the 3D area.
Nice.
I do teach animation in media arts and visual arts and studies, and I'm teaching with Alice Nelson in Arts of Urgency. There might be a few Arts of Urgency students here today. I don't know. It's optional.
And Alice is?
Alice is Latin American studies, cultural studies literature.
So nice range of disciplines. I encourage all of you to think about when you come to these talks about, there's this serendipitous thing that happens that the speaker seems to sometimes hit on the themes that are going on in your programs, sometimes as if by magic. So look for those connections. Don't assume that because you're in a certain program that the issues that are coming up for the speaker are not relevant to the issues that are coming up in your program. And then I just want to quickly thank the support people that help make this happen. We've got administrative support from Julie Ron. We have people that help secure these spaces, which takes a lot of support to do that just can get complicated. So really, really thank the people that make this happen. And then we have the electronic media plus student aides that are also helping to record and set up the AV equipment. So, and then the college for supporting us. I'm going to go quickly through the speakers. Today we have Rafael Soldi, and Ryan Clark will introduce Rafael in a minute. Week 4 we have Klara Glosova. She's a Czech-born artist based in Seattle and works prolifically with multimedia. So she'll be coming week 4. Week 6 is Austin Brown, who is an Evergreen alum, coming in from Chicago. He uses a site-based practice built using sound, video, and installation to draw conceptual lines between sites, using buildings as evidence to investigate histories of urban planning. Week 8, we have Carol Roshana Williams, and this is a quote from Carol, who's based in Seattle. A large body of my work deals with environmentalism, Pacific Northwest conifers, old-growth trees, endangered animals, and climate change. A quick word on etiquette when the end of the talk comes and the Q&A starts, that please don't get up and go. Please stay for the whole hour and a half and participate. So thanks for coming, and we'll have Ryan Clark come and introduce Rafael.
Hello, everyone. Rafael Soldi is a Peruvian-born, Seattle-based artist and curator. He holds a BFA in Photography and Curatorial Studies from the Maryland Institute College of Art, and he has exhibited internationally at places like the Frye Art Museum, the American University Museum, Griffin Museum of Photography, amongst others. He has been awarded residencies at the Vermont Studio Center, Picture Berlin, Oxbow Space, and the Bogliasco Foundation. His work focuses primarily rooted in photography and has kind of evolved away from that, and focuses a lot on ideas of identity and is rooted in his Peruvian identity and yeah, let's just let him talk.
Thank you. Let me plug this in, make sure we're... All right, that worked. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Shaw. Thank you, all of you, for coming out, Evergreen for having me. It's really a pleasure. What an awesome turnout and mix of disciplines and interests. So it's really exciting to talk to a diverse crowd. Before we start, I actually want to take a picture of all of you because you look great. If you don't want to be in the picture, you can cover your face. Let's see. And just wave. There we go. Awesome. I figure, if I'm going to be filmed, then I got to put you in the same, position. Okay. So, as Ryan said, I was born and raised in Peru. That's where I spent most of my life. And actually, as I say this, I have to catch myself because I just realized that as of this year, I have spent more than half my life in the United States than I have in Peru. And that kind of has brought on a bit of an identity crisis because, as I said, I didn't say that earlier just so that I could say this. I've said most of my life that I've spent most of my life in Peru. So it's been an interesting transition and moment of reckoning with my own identity. And that's where I grew up. And sometimes it feels so far away, it's hard to believe it. But my work is, as you'll see, really concerned with these questions that really make up my identity and how they sort of mirror the world around me, the world around you as well. And particularly as it relates to my queerness, as it relates to my upbringing as a Latinx man, what it means to build masculinity, what it means to immigrate. So I'd love to share some of that with you today. Before I kind of dive into my work, I work primarily as an artist, as a visual artist. I also have a curatorial practice that, if we have time, I'll share a little bit about. And then I also practice actively as a commercial photographer, and I do some design and other things. And I say that because I think it's really important for those of you who may go out into the world and want to become artists to understand that there is an economy that may or may not support you. And if you want to talk about that later, I'm happy to share literally how I make money and how I stay sort of afloat as an artist, because I think there's a conversation that oftentimes gets swept under the rug. So I'm really happy to talk about that openly and share some of those, success stories, struggles, whatever you want to know. But I think being an artist is a very sort of clouded position, often crowded by this romantic idea of what it means. And I'm really interested in kind of pulling that curtain and talking about that. So I'd like to begin quickly running through some work that I made right out of school, because I think a lot of you are maybe in this position where you're about to get out of school and figure out what you want to do. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but when I was in school, I met a man who became my partner, and we were together for about 4 years. And I was very young at the time, and he became sort of a vehicle for me to understand my own queerness, to access certain experiences. It became a way for me to communicate with my parents about my queerness. I had come out, but beyond that, there was no natural way to talk about it that wasn't very awkward. So for them to be able to ask, like, how is he doing? How are you guys doing? What is he up to? Became this vehicle for accessing this communication and became an important part of building my identity. We moved to New York together. We had this really loving and supportive relationship. And then one night we had a pretty stupid fight. And then the next day he wasn't there. And then I never saw him again for 10 years. He just simply disappeared. And I knew through friends and family that he was alive. Like, it wasn't like he was, kidnapped or something, but he essentially had some kind of breakdown. But I didn't really connect with him until 10 years later. And that experience really shaped my life in a big way. It really thrust me into, I had honestly a pretty, other than normal struggles of growing up as a gay kid, I had a pretty comfortable life with a loving family and no real losses until later in my life in terms of grandparents and things like that. And this became my first experience with grief and panic and regret and loss and all of these really complex things. So this work was made in the years that followed that event. And at the time I was working pretty traditionally as a photographer. I was working with a medium format color film camera. My sort of strategies and techniques in general are fairly primitive. I'm not really into fancy technology or lots of technical stuff, so I was working with natural light. This image was made before we broke up, so I brought in some images from earlier in our relationship from a project I've been working on before into it. And I'll just go through some of these. It was a mix of photographing myself, photographing things around me, and other things that sort of were helping me process this information. Just pretty run-of-the-mill young artist breakup work, we all do it. But it was really important to me. It really, it gave me a lot of purpose. It gave me a way to process what I was feeling, and also having just come out of school and having no idea what I was going to be making, it gave me a narrative to follow and to at least flex some of my creative, muscle. This is, I think, one of the last images I made in the series. Several years after the breakup happened, actually because of that breakup, I ended up relocating to Seattle because it was the farthest place I could find on the map from New York City at the time within this country, and that's where I went. And that's why that first image is sort of that map. And this is sort of around the time when I was already getting ready to move forward in a different way. And I was thinking back to some of the things I've been feeling, and I was in my apartment, which was kind of my first apartment on my own, and I see these flowers sitting on the windowsill, and these curtains are sort of, billowing out, just beautifully being blown into the room, just sort of dancing through, and then they were being sucked out really violently, out of the window, and then they were pushing out again in this beautiful kind of almost dancing kind of way, very poetic, and then sucked right in again in this very violent way. And it reminded me of what it felt like to go through those last few years, this idea that life is both the beautiful, blowing, poetic moments and also those suffocating, can't breathe kind of moments. And I really love that moment as a metaphor for that. And I do think the world sends you these little nuggets for you to look at your life through. For those of you who are photographers in the room, I mentioned I'm not a very technical person. This image, which, looks pretty different on the projection, but which looks very studio lit. Actually, there's a window on the left. This is my kitchen window, my kitchen table. There's a window on the left, and then on the right-hand side, I just opened my fridge, and that was my reflector. So if you're ever don't have a reflector handy, you can carry your fridge around, and that's pretty useful. And this is what the work is presented as. This is at Gibson Gallery, and this is actually an exhibition titled I think it's In the Absence of ... and it was actually curated by Clara Glasova, who's going to be a speaker here, I think next time. So Claire is wonderful, and she co-curated this show with Sierra Stinson, and you can see sort of the entirety of the project there. They're 24 by 30, so they're medium-sized color images, edition of 10. The work in the front is a sculpture, not by me, by Alice Gosti, who's an amazing choreographer here in Seattle and conceptual artist. So around this time, I made all this work, and a long time passed. And something that I like to relay to those of you who are looking to pursue an art career is that it's a really long game. There's a lot of anxiety, especially right out of school, but in general, to make work. And the reality is that being an artist is not always making work. There are a lot of people who produce work all the time, but there's a great deal of thinking that happens. There's a great deal of administrative work that happens. Sometimes you spend a whole year just applying to shows, and then it takes another year to hear back, and then you're not showing that work until the year after. And 3 years when you're in college seems like an unbelievably long time, but in the span of your career, I always think it's silly that you may spend 5 years making work, and then you put it out, and a year later it feels old, or you're afraid that people may not want to show old work. And I'm like, you just spent 5 years making it. Why is it old a year later? So for me, it took me a little bit of time to get into this rhythm of knowing that when I'm not making work, it doesn't mean that I'm not being an artist or I'm not being productive, but rather that's time to maybe do some admin work. It's time to do some outreach, meet with curators, share my work with other people, work on my exhibitions, do some writing. So I had finished this body of work, and I wasn't very well connected, so I wasn't showing it. I wasn't making new work. So several years passed, and by then I think it had been maybe 5 years since my partner had disappeared. So I was well kind of beyond the grieving and all of that. I was sort of in a new place. But I was curious about what happened with, I noticed that my psyche and sort of the composition of my inner self had really changed because of this trauma. And I'll come back to that, but I encountered this piece, I think it was in San Francisco, but this is a piece by Robert Rauschenberg. I don't know if any of you know it, but it's called Erased de Kooning, and it's one of my favorite pieces of art. It's essentially, Robert Rauschenberg was a young artist at the time. Willem de Kooning was this towering figure of, you know, abstract expressionism. And Rauschenberg said, hey, you know, my name is Robert, and I would like to have one of your drawings so I can erase it and present it up as my own work. And Willem de Kooning was like, okay, well, that sounds interesting. Why don't I give you sort of the darkest, most like charcoal heavy drawing I have? And Rauschenberg spent, you know, weeks painstakingly erasing this drawing and then presenting this blank sheet of paper as his own work. And to me, this is so much more powerful than just seeing a drawing. You know, there's a latent like memory on that page, even if you don't see anything, that's really, really powerful. And it really got me thinking about what happens to memory, what happens to the things we've lived, the things we've pictured, the things we've experienced, and is it just because it's no longer there, does that mean it's no longer there, or is it there in a different way? And at the time I had gone home and my parents were moving, and my mom gave me a box of stuff. And she was like, this is your stuff, take it, like I don't want to store it anymore. And in there I found all these pictures that I had stored years and years ago of my ex-partner and I. There were pictures from trips and things we had done and pictures of each other, and, you know, back when we would print them and keep them in albums and stuff. And I didn't know what to do with them because I felt that I had moved on from it. Throwing them away seemed petty and weird, but keeping them, like displaying them, seemed odd. And I didn't know what to do with them because once I had grieved the whole thing, they were really lovely memories, and there were things that did happen, and there were times that were had. And I took inspiration from this piece, and I decided to essentially mount them backwards. So what you see, so essentially erasing the front by putting adhesive to it permanently, and what you see is the verso of the images. And creating essentially this abstract white-on-white work that when you look at it, you immediately recognize as a picture, but you recognize it as the back of a picture. And I found that people really responded to it because they knew exactly what it was, but they were so curious to know what was on the other side and why in hell I would put, you know, glue on the front of a picture and just display the back. And the backs had their own histories as well. You know, some were torn, some were dirty, some were handled. And I found that what people asked me the most was, well, do you remember what's on the other side? And at first I did, and then eventually over time, I forgot. But what I forgot really was the picture. I never really forgot the feeling. I never really forgot what it felt like to do those things with him. I never really forgot what it meant to be together for 4 years, or what it meant for us to experience these things. So they become sort of proof that we did happen, and beyond that, and like for me, that's enough, you know. And so it becomes a study on memory, and just sort of how memory fades, and the more time passes, maybe we begin to forget the details and the colors and the shapes, but we never really let go of that really visceral quality that memory carries. So sort of from that moment, from that starting point, I began to think about what to make next. Okay, so this looks like a black picture to you, I think. Yeah. So on my screen, there's quite a bit of detail. On here, you just see a black square, so I'm going to skip this one. At the same time, in that box of pictures, I found this document that my parents kept, which is an EKG that they made of my heart when I was, I think, 12, maybe 10-ish years old. There was a history of heart condition in my family. My uncle had a heart attack, and my mom just wanted to make sure that we were all kind of okay, that there was no anomalies with our heart. And we'll ignore that thing on the top. And I found this document, and immediately my first thought was, wow, this is really beautiful. You know, it's the mark on this piece of paper reminds me of like Cy Twombly with a stick, you know, like painting on the walls. And the blue ink on this sort of graph paper had a really interesting formal quality. And it dawned on me that, you know, my heart made this drawing. And I'm not a draftsman. I can't draw for shit. Like, I'm not a good drawer at all. But a different part of my body that's not my hand made this. And I thought it was really interesting to have the privilege to get a portrait of my heart at a time when, you know, my metaphorical heart was very innocent and very unbroken and sort of uncorrupted. So I started sort of displaying this along some of the other works. I'm going to skip this one too. There's a lot of contrast on that screen. But these works, it's hard to see. This is an image of two waves kind of merging into one another. And I started making these works which are black on black. If you're interested in seeing them, you can come down later and I'll pull them up on my screen so you can see. But there's a great amount of detail and subtlety in these details. And a lot of these works are paneled, so 2 panels, 3 panels. You'll see a few more here. And it became a way for me to start making small steps away from photography, but keeping my roots, holding on to this photographic sort of process that I learned in school, that I was educated in, but starting to think of the photograph as a more expanded thing, and a more sculptural thing that we could play with, that it didn't have to be one panel, one frame, one matte, one picture. It didn't even have to have glass or something else around it. So this is a 2-paneled piece that shows these ocean waves kind of going into one another. And they're very striking to see in person because I print them through, I print them on a matte paper, and then I do what is called a velvet laminate. It's a lamination process that makes it so incredibly matte that you start to lose perspective of like how close it is to you. Most people think it's a charcoal drawing, and they're quite large, so you start to get lost in the pictures. And I became really interested, again, as I said earlier, in what happens to your psyche after you experience trauma. And for me, I found that there was an innerness that was really abstract. There were parts of myself that were showing up that I never knew were there. And I think it's really interesting that this can happen for the length of your life, that you can be 50 or 60 or 70 and discover something new about yourself, and how little autonomy we have over this like pile of flesh that we like walk on every day. You know, that we think we're really aware of who we are. We look at ourselves in the mirror every day, but really there's a very abstract sort of psyche inside of you that's its own thing, you know. And they say, someone probably knows the exact number here, but that we only use or understand like a tiny percentage of our brain. Like, that's terrifying / really fascinating, you know, that there's a thinking entity in our skull that of which we only understand the tiniest fraction. That, I mean, to me, that's fascinating. This is one of the first works that I made that investigates my relationship to Peru, and it's all, again, part of this series, trying to understand, where do I come from? What does this mean? Who am I? What am I? And like I said, I grew up in Peru. I grew up on the ocean, in Lima, right on the capital. And to me, the sun setting like on the west and the Pacific was a part of my everyday life. It's not really, I wouldn't say it was an important part. I didn't really think about it, but it happened every day for 15 years in front of my eyes. So I have to say it was a part of my life. And it was there. Like I saw it setting every day. And then I moved to the East Coast, and the sun would always set behind a building. And I never thought about it. You know, it's just what the sun does. And I spent a lot of time growing up also at the beach and in the ocean. And then I moved to Seattle after having this rearranging of my insights. And I'm walking down like Pine Street one day, and I see this beautiful glowing sun just setting behind the Pacific Ocean, like right in the Sound. And it just kind of hit me all of a sudden, and I got this really this really strong sense of nostalgia, of yearning, of home. And I had not felt that before. I had in fact felt a lot of resentment towards my home for the longest time. And it kind of really made me realize, like, that is the exact same sun that set in front of my eyes every day of my childhood, setting behind the exact same ocean, but I'm 5,000 miles up the road. And this sort of idea that that something like this can follow you, you know, it's so cheesy, right? But this whole thing about like home is where your heart's at, home is where, and for me, this piece is called The Sun Will Set in the Same Place, and this really made me realize just because I've left that place, it doesn't mean I can escape it. It doesn't mean that I get to just walk away from it and say, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. I have to deal with the implications of being from there and what that means and why that's important and why that's bothering me. This piece is called And All of a Sudden You Were Gone, and is one of the only pieces in this series that actually actively like looks back to my breakup. And really it's not about the breakup, it's more about an experience that I had in the years following. I had already moved to Seattle. It'd been about, I think, 2 years since our breakup, and I remember very clearly having this sort of serendipitous moment of clarity, waking up one morning and realizing, you know, I'm in a new place, I'm in a new city, I have new friends, I have a new job. I am really feeling ready to move on from all of this trauma. Like, today is the day. And I felt really excited and really empowered, and I just remember like getting out of bed, taking a shower, and then coming out and seeing my phone and seeing a text from my ex, which was the first time I had heard from him since he had left. And the text said, "Hey, are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, why do you ask?" And he said, "I just had a really crazy feeling that all of a sudden you were gone. Like someone had died." And I was just like, yeah, because I just woke up this morning and I removed myself from you and I removed you from me and I decided to move on. And I have never really been a spiritual person. I grew up in a Catholic school, and I was always very like, I'm an atheist, I was very anti all that stuff. And this really kind of shook me. And it made me realize that I really needed to take a step back and think about the world as a much more complex place than I think it is. And I think a lot of that is growing up too. I think a lot of those things, as you grow up, you become more aware of how mysterious the universe around you is and how we don't really control much. But it really shook me, and it threw me into a new period in my life where I really started to become more humble and to understand how small I am and how much there is that I don't understand, and how it is okay that I don't understand it. And this piece was made about 5 years later. It took me a really long time because I thought, for the longest time, I thought I was a photographer and that I had to make a picture of it. And I didn't know how to make a picture of it. And it wasn't until later that I realized that it didn't have to be a picture, it could be something else. And these are not pictures, these are digitally created. There are 10 panels, it's about 14 feet long. And I made it purposely somewhat abstract because I didn't want to tell. I tell a story when I'm talking to people, but I didn't want to tell it so specifically. So it essentially denotes this general idea of We have energy, we hold energy, we put it out into the world, which is a risk. And once it's out there, once you throw it, at the wall, it's not yours anymore. But what you have to understand is that eventually it'll hit something. And that's going to be another person, that's going to be another being, that's going to be something. And that person or that thing is going to take on that energy and do something else with it. And that's sort of what you see here. It's the black section sort of representing me, and then the lower portion technically representing my ex, but really just representing that vessel that takes on that energy and feels it and turns it into something else. I like that a lot of people who encounter this piece without knowing exactly what it's about tend to land in the general vicinity of what it's about, but they all have their own interpretation, and I love that. That's not specific. It evokes ideas of timelines, ideas of spirituality, of mandalas, orbs, even shutter speeds, opening and closing, moons, eclipses. Like, there's so many ways to read it. But essentially there is a path, there is an openness, a letting go, and then a return, I'll skip this one too. Okay. My new work is not black, so that's good. So I'll move on to some of the newer work from here. This is at a residency that I did at Oxbow Space in Seattle recently, where I was able to install some of the work and photograph it. You can see the piece in the back that we're just talking about. The ones on the left are two small pieces that I made. One diptych is a close-up contact print made with a 4x5 of the palms of my hands, my right and my left palm, and it kind of looks like a dark landscape until you realize what it is. And the one on the left is the inside of my left and my right eye, which I collaborated with my optometrist to make that, which was really fun. Something that I like to note is that here's a show I had in New York at ClampArt, is that like I said, I stem from photography, but I'm not interested in technical stuff. And this show is a good example because someone, some like old white guy came in and was like, what camera did you use to shoot all this stuff? And I realized at that point that, I hadn't thought about that. And the work on the left, which I'll talk about in a minute, was made with a photo booth. The piece in the back, which is the waves, you can't really see it, was shot with a DSLR. The vertical piece, large piece on the right, was shot with a digital Hasselblad that I borrowed from a friend. The portraits here on the right were shot with medium format color film, which I then transferred to black and white. The pictures of my eyes I made with my optometrist. The pictures of my hands I made with a 4x5 camera contact print. So literally every single image in the show, even though it looked cohesive and together, was made with a different picture-making device. And I never thought about that. It was just what seemed to make sense to me at the time for the making of each piece. That brings me to this body of work called Imagined Futures. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be an immigrant, and I touched on this a little bit when I talked about the sun, but I realized that when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time thinking about my future. I was really aware of my queerness in an abstract sense since I was younger. I didn't know what it meant. All I knew is that I was different. I knew that the way society around me defined what a man is wasn't what I was, which made me feel really weird. And it made me feel like whatever I did, I was destined to fail. I was destined to disappoint because I knew I wasn't what they wanted me to be. And the idea of being something else seemed really unlikely or difficult or agonizing. And I spent a lot of time thinking about my future and what I would be. My friends were all talking about, I'm going to be a lawyer like my dad, or I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to be this or that. And all I could think was, I'm going to be really unhappy. Like, I couldn't even think about being something because everything that I saw mirrored out in the world wasn't me. So it was really hard to even think about what I wanted to do, which not makes sense. Like I wanted to be an artist, but that wasn't even an option. Like I didn't see that. So definitely no effeminate men, no soft men, no artists. Yeah, it was all very prescribed. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this. When I moved to the US, I moved here with my family, and then my parents for my dad's job, and then my parents went back to Peru 2 years later. I stayed. I was in my last year of high school. And it was actually my mom who told me, essentially, I was 16, who said, I think you should stay here. Because if we go back to Peru, I don't think you're going to be happy. And now I realize what a sacrifice that was for a Latin mother to leave her 16-year-old son alone in another country, just because she thought I'd be happier here. I really am so grateful for her making that choice for me. But immediately I just went into resentment mode. You know, I hate my country. I don't like that place. I don't like being from there. It didn't want me. It didn't want me to be what I wanted to be. I'm here now. I have opportunity. I can go to art school. I can be what I want. And I can have a boyfriend. Like, it just all opened up. And I felt really kind of ready to, like, take the world and come out of my shell. And but over time, little bits of my childhood would creep in. And primarily I kept thinking about what would have happened if I had stayed. What would my future look like? And I would go back to Peru to visit my family and look around and be like, do I see someone now who maybe reflects who I could be? Was I wrong to think that as a kid? And I still kind of couldn't, and it kept bothering me, like what would have happened to that kid if I didn't have the privilege that I had to leave? What would have happened to that kid? Where would he be? What would he be doing? Maybe he'd be fine, you know, maybe he wouldn't, I don't know. And I realized that that was weighing really heavy on me, and that what I was feeling wasn't resentment or anger, it was really just grief, that I hadn't taken the time to grieve all of the lives that didn't come to fruition. That when you leave your country to go somewhere else, we don't have an understanding or a process for mourning the life that you left behind. We're supposed to leave and then be grateful for what we've been given somewhere else. But what happens to that life? All those futures that I imagined, are they in me, or did they go and find someone else to live them? Maybe someone who was happy with what that looked like. I don't know. And I spent 2 years processing that. And every time that one of those thoughts kind of floated to the surface, one of those imagined futures is what I call them, I would find a photo booth, I would step into it, I would close my eyes, and I would say thank you, and I would give it permission to go. And I would make 4 pictures as that happened. So it's a performance, it's documentation of a performance. And I did that for about 2 years, and it became a really helpful ritual for me in processing this information. The booth I was really attracted to because it reminded me of the confessionals of my youth at the Catholic school, getting to this tiny little room, and which I always found really uncomfortable. Like, I have to get in here and talk to a man I don't know through a screen and tell him my secrets so he can tell me what's wrong with me and to go ask for forgiveness. Like, no ma'am. But I like the idea of sort of taking that experience and making it my own, of taking this chamber, taking this place and making it a place for forgiveness and making it a place for grieving, a place for myself to move on. And it was interesting too, because the booth is it's a camera, but it's a camera that you step into and you make a picture from its belly, you know, from its womb. And you don't really operate it other than putting money into it. It operates itself. So it's very autonomous, which meant I could focus on my task and the booth could focus on its task. And it would become both a collaborator and a witness to what was happening. And then it would spit out this strip, and the strip was a silver gelatin print. It was completely unique. Not only the whole strip, there's no copy, but also each moment, each picture within this strip is a unique moment in time, separated by 2 or 3 seconds. And I liked the sort of ephemeral nature of that. Because when you make a copy of something or you take a picture of a performance, you can reproduce it as many times as you want. But the picture was made at the same time that I was doing that, and then that's the only copy of it, and it's, you know, it all happened together, you know. I've talked to a lot of immigrants since about this process, and I've learned that this is a very universal concern, that most, if not all, immigrants have some kind of complicated relationship with the place they're from. Sometimes they left really, really young, and that relationship is to something that's very ethereal and very abstract and very far away, but it's there. A lot of people feel it in a generational way. A lot of people were born in this country, but their parents immigrated, and it's not that different from Jewish folks who say they feel the pain of their grandparents who went through the Holocaust or something like that. I'm not comparing immigrating to the Holocaust, but this idea of trauma being passed on through generations and collective memory, I think, is really real. So this work is complete. I've shown it at a few different places, and Candor Arts, which is a really amazing publisher in Chicago, approached me to do a book, and we're working on it right now. It comes out in November at the Chicago Art Book Fair in about a month, so we're like going to press. So it's been really exciting to have some text commissioned. I hired a writer named Miguel Lopez, who's a queer Latino writer from Peru who now works in Costa Rica, who wrote a really wonderful text that puts the work sort of in an academic and social context. And we're working through that design. We just had a call this morning where we completely scrapped what we had been doing and decided to, instead of making the book a traditional book, to make it more of an object, so you can take the pages and put them in your own arrangements. So that, I don't know how that's gonna, we're figuring that out right now, but it's really exciting to be in that process of thinking through, you know, that does this book make the work justice in how it's experienced in real life, or is there another way to think about what a book is and how it's experienced? So that's been really exciting. I'm really fortunate. Candor is an amazing publisher, and they make everything by hand with the exception of printing the pages. So we have a lot of flexibility in what we can do. Their website's amazing if you want to look at cool book-like options. Here's all 50 of them. Recently, I had a show in Philadelphia in January when these were on their way back to me. There was a box that had 20 of them. The box got stolen from a FedEx truck, and 5 of them were found in a dumpster by a bus stop in Philadelphia, and the other 14 were never found. So I had all of a sudden I was forced to face kind of the loss of the work in a very material way, which at first was really hard and then actually very easy, because I had been doing so much work to emotionally detach from these futures and let them go. And then once they were gone, I was so sad. And my partner was like, isn't that what you were trying to do to begin with? Like, to just be okay with what? And I was like, you know, it's fine. Like, there's 36 now. There were 50. And that's that, you know. So I'll quickly, how are we doing on time, Michelle? I don't know. I didn't put my timer on. More of total? Great. So I want to show you a little video here of just the installation. We did this video with, there's no sound, but it's okay. This was a video we created with my residency at Oxbow, and it just kind of shows the process of installing and setting up all the work. So that's kind of where this is at right now. We're in the process of looking for an institution to acquire the piece. It is all one piece, So it's hard to place a work, that's quite large with an institution. So we're looking at museums and foundations that may be interested in taking on that. This brings me to a new body of work that I've recently completed, but I'm still working on different arms and legs of this project. And I see all of this as being, that's the title of the work. I see all of this as being different parts of my practice, but really one larger body of work. And it's hard, when you're in school, you're taught to work in series or in projects. And the reason that is mostly because it's a teaching tool. We need to find a way to grade you. We need to find a way to give you parameters, to get you to learn how to do something from start to finish, to do an artist statement, to think about presentation. But in the real world, it doesn't always work that way. And I think it's really important to have some perspective on that. Especially in photography, we're taught, that you have to work in series or you have to work in projects. And it's oftentimes great to have some parameters to help you figure that out. But sometimes it's a little bit more organic than that in the real world when you're making work. And so for me, the body of work I just showed, the last two really, Imagined Futures and Life Stands Still Here, are two separate things that my gallery likes to show in two separate ways or sometimes kind of together. But to me, they all bleed into one another and they're all part of a bigger exploration. And it might be that it's something related to how I move through the world. Maybe this is something that tells the story of my late 20s and early 30s. Maybe it's something that tells the story of 10, 15 years in my life. Or maybe it's something that it just tells the story of the rest of my life. I don't know. But I'm hesitant to call these kind of separate projects because I really do think of them as different ways to explore the same bigger issue, which is trying to come to terms with my identity, my sexuality, loss, where I come from, why are things happening the way they're happening, and how to reckon all of this together. Cargamontón is a Spanish word that's primarily from the vernacular of Peru, where I'm from. And it's used to describe a game that I think is actually played in a lot of different countries, but it's essentially a hazing ritual used in school where kids will essentially find the weaker kid or the kid they're trying to bully or oppress, and then you go run up to that kid, you wrestle him to the ground, you pin him down, and then everybody else runs behind you and piles up like a pig pile until that person is kind of suffocating under a big pile of bodies. And that we called cargamontón in Peru, which translates, if you kind of take the word apart, carga means to carry, it can also mean a load, and montón means to like mount on something. It's also interesting because the way it's used today in the vernacular is literally in the dictionary defined as the harassment of one by many, and is primarily used today in political speak when like many congressmen are like going up against one person or something like that to put pressure. So I became really interested in thinking about this because I had already opened the gates to thinking about my childhood and Peru and what my relationship to that place was and why it was so hard to deal with it. And I think it's because I wasn't really addressing some of the darker moments of my childhood. I always felt a certain kind of guilt also because whenever I talked to my parents about struggling with my sexuality as a kid, they always said, but we gave you everything. You had food on your table, your siblings loved you, we loved you, and I always felt so guilty about expressing any kind of discomfort with what happened to me as a kid. And then I realized, like, those are two very different things. Whatever you did as a parent to love me and nurture me has nothing to do with the shitty things people around you did to me. That's just the world. That's how it works, you know? But I got a Facebook message from a kid I went to high school with that I hadn't talked to since, since I left like 15 years ago. And he sent me this message that said, hey, I know we haven't talked in a really long time, but I just wanted to tell you that I'm really sorry, that I've been thinking about this a lot and I can't get it out of my head, and we were just real assholes to you when we were kids. And we treated you really badly, and we, did a lot of shit to you that was violent and said a lot of shitty things, and we just feel really, I feel really bad, and I just wanted to apologize. And I think it was funny because I don't really remember him as being mean to me or saying any of those things, but clearly it was really bothering him, and clearly he couldn't get it out of his head. And I think sometimes we as queer people, we find ways to put that stuff behind us and to move on with our lives in a different way. And it really made me think about, and I started a conversation with him, and I said, what do you remember? Like, why are you apologizing? And he started telling me all these like crystal clear memories he had of all these things they had done to me. And I was like, oh yeah, like that happened, you're right, and I just remember at the time sometimes going numb or just being like, whatever, like this is my life, like just do what you're gonna do and we can just move on. And I was like, yeah, that was really messed up. Like that wasn't cool. And I started doing some research and just kind of looking online, poking at, are there any articles about this or any people talking about their experiences? Or is there any images, any other projects about it? What's out there? And I started finding these videos on YouTube that kids were posting. Mostly, this is something that happened primarily, I want to say like 90s, early 2000s, maybe even a little earlier. But now I talk to some kids who are in school now and they're like, oh no, we just bully online. Like it's different now. And that was like, okay, that's different. But I found footage that was posted on the internet of kids doing this. Mostly it's playful. It happens in the playground. It happens, during recess. And they're just monkeying around, like having fun. But really there's a very oppressive kind of dark twist to it that I find really fascinating. So kids were filming this and then posting it on YouTube. Usually the video is not of great quality because it's a little bit older. And when I typed that word, all the videos that came up were from Peru. And I could tell by the accents and the words that people were using. And some of them were very violent, some of them were very playful. But what I remember is, as a kid coming to terms with my sexuality, I knew that I was attracted to men, but I didn't know what that meant and how to pursue any kind of intimacy or connection with the men around me. And I found that these violent kind of rites were also my only avenue to intimacy. And that when all these kids would come, like it was an all-boys school, push me to the ground and pile on top of me, I was really scared and I was really annoyed and I didn't like being picked on, but also I was close to them and I could feel them breathing in my ear and I could feel them touching me and I could touch them, and there was a certain sort of sensuality and intimacy to the whole thing that felt okay. And all of a sudden I was like, well, if this is the only way I'm going to be able to reach some kind of intimacy with another man, then so be it. So I began to equate, to think of intimacy and violence as this codependent thing, which I think is very true for a lot of men, but especially young men, that if you want to pat your buddy on the back, you better do it at the football game, or you better do it, in a very violent way, because if you do it softly, you're gay. And, it's, there's this culture in this country that touch and intimacy amongst men must always be paired with violence, or like no homo, And I think that's so interesting. And I began to think about, wow, how messed up is it that a 10-year-old kid is starting to build this idea of intimacy and violence as like really codependent, and not really seeking violence, but understanding violence toward him as an opportunity. for something he wants. And so it was just really complicated. I began to look at this footage and take images of my screen and then degrade the screen and then print it again and photograph it again to create these images that really vacillate between torture and pleasure. I wanted you to look at this and not know if you're looking at like Guantanamo Bay or like two kids playing in a playground. And it's the latter, but to me it looks pretty sinister. Some of them feel very intimate, some of them feel very violent. Some of them feel explosive. And in some of them, you can tell exactly what's going on. Some of them are more abstract. And in some, you can tell they're 12, you know? And then in others, they look like grown men. The point of view is always very voyeuristic. There's a hint sort of at surveillance footage. This is an exhibition I had in Vancouver at the Burrard Arts Foundation, and it shows both projects, the Imagined Futures and Cargamonton next to it. They're pretty small pieces. I didn't want to make them very large, so they're probably about like this big. So yeah, so this is the last thing I completed, which was at the end of last year, early this year. And I feel like from this point, I've been really simmering a lot on these experiences. And I went back to Peru recently, earlier this year, and I created my first video work, which is not done yet. It's actually in post-production right now. I'm working with an editor to finish the editing work, and then with the sound technician to create all the sound for the piece. But I am right now really interested in those markers and signifiers from my youth, specifically from my school years, that were meant to form my masculinity. Essentially, I was really interested in how we were expected to understand masculinity. One of those ways was through marching. We were not a military school or a military state, but every July during our Independence Day, which is the 28th of July, we as a school had to march. And I always found it very silly. We had to put on these, our school uniforms and wear these like red braids, and there were batons, and we had to do this march. And we would practice for months and months in the sun, and it was hot. And they would bring these like people from the military to train us, and it was like left, right, left, right, left, right. And I'm like, we're just kids, like trying to have a good time. Like, why are we doing this? But there was also, so there was an expectation that you would be good at that, and that there was the masculine thing to do. There was also 3 kids, like these 3 who are always chosen to lead your class and your march, and those were always like the manliest, the tallest. It was always an honor to be chosen, and they would have the baton. And now I kind of look back and I'm like, the whole thing is so campy. It's just like we have these big braids, and they're holding these big phallic batons, and they're like waving them around like they're men, and the whole thing just seems so silly. But it was, again, this display of masculinity, and I don't know, I have this vivid memory of it. So I went back to Peru, and I hired 3 kids, 3 high school age kids, 2 of whom actually go to the school that I went to. And we did this video piece which shows them marching in place, and it's a 3-channel screen. So you would be in a room, a square room, with 1 screen in front of you and 1 on each side, and they're kind of pretty larger than life, and you see these close-ups of their faces, and you see their sweat kind of dripping through their nose, and you realize that they're like just kids, like they're just kids trying to be men, and they're marching, and then there are these really thunderous moments where you hear the march really loudly and it's overwhelming, and these quiet moments where they're just putting on their gloves and all you hear is just the cotton and they're breathing. And again, you see them as, you know they go home and like mom is there and they're little babies, so I love that dichotomy. I'm working on another piece that I haven't shot yet, that I'm working on some funding for, hoping to shoot next year, where I'll be hiring about 12 to 15 kids to recreate these hazing rituals, the Caragamonton ones. I'm working on what that's going to look like, but that's sort of the direction I'm going right now. Again, still very rooted in photography, but trying different things and looking at moving image now. So that's where I'm at with my practice. I think we have a few more minutes, so I'll briefly run through some of my curatorial work just to share the other side. Yeah. Oh, it's time for Q&A? Yeah, then we're good. Cool. I'll leave it here. So. Thank you. See. Yes, we're here.
I had a comment and a question.
Yeah.
My mom was born in '66, and she grew up in Huanta,
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
it's funny, she has photos like marching, same thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting that like nothing has really changed
Yeah.
from that long ago. And then my question was, when we were talking about the Caragamonton, that like it seems like people, or like you, like when you're impressed, you kind of like internalized it, but you had no like way of realizing that. And do you think like now, like people who are going through similar situations, that there's ways that you can kind of work through that and transform that and be more aware of those things?
You mean in the moment as opposed to later? Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the kind of support you have around you too. I think some people have a lot of support at home and school and feel very empowered to work through those things. I also think there's a there's a very different understanding today around mental health and in terms of resources. But for me, it took me time, and I think I needed that time. I think none of those experiences were really life or death for me. For a lot of people are life or death. And I don't think that I was really ready to process any of it until I had some of the context and experiences that I've had today. Or even I think I feel so much more prepared today to deal with those things. I think for a long time they were buried in my body for a reason, because I didn't have the tools, So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't necessarily think that people need to process that information like right then on the spot. I think time is important. Yeah.
Do you remember the feelings when you came back to Peru after being a long time in America? What was your feelings?
What were my feelings when I came back to Peru after being here for a long time? I actually went back almost every year for Christmas to see my family, but I think for the longest time I was just numb. I was like, I'm going to see my family and then I'm getting on a plane back. And only recently I've started to spend more time connecting there with the culture. I'm actually showing this work in Peru next week at a museum, and that's going to be interesting. Like, I had to translate my statement to Spanish, and I had to talk to curators about it. And I actually went to, there's this Facebook group with all my high school class they created recently, and I haven't told them about the work, but I encouraged all of them to go to my exhibition. So I'm really hoping they'll go and see what's up. So, but I think it's changed over time. Yeah, I think it's gone from not wanting anything to do with it to now an incredible curiosity about where I'm from. So yeah.
I kind of have a comment and a question. I was going to say thank you very much for your presentation, and I feel like you just kind of said you didn't have the idea that a camera was kind of the first tool you had, and maybe you use that as like a means of like processing. And there's like this sort of pattern, like it's like very stoic but vulnerable, like facing what you're trying to deal with, like your ex, for example, and like these sort of experiences at your school by seeing them all the time, but also like using them to process. And I was wondering if by doing this, have you found that also you kind of fallen into the role of a teacher as well as an artist?
Mm-hmm. As in teacher to others, or yeah, I really try to. I think people can choose to deal with this stuff in whatever way they choose. You know, for some people that's therapy. For some people that's very internal. For me, it's internal, but it's also like here in a screen in front of 2,200 people. And I really hope that people who are interested in sharing emotional work and personal work feel empowered to do so. I think that the more personal something is, the more universal it becomes. And I think if work that just kind of draws like really broad strokes over very broad subjects are very hard to connect to. And I think things that are very personal and very specific, it doesn't have to be about your struggles, or like it can be specific in different ways. In the end, actually connects with more people than things that are very general and very, very open. So, yeah, back there. Yeah.
Do you see grief as a blessing in disguise as a way of like deepening us as artists?
You could say that. I mean, I think all emotions that are tough to get through are a blessing in disguise. I think they're hard when they're hard, but eventually they unlock, you know, that they really make you grow up in different ways and learn a lot about yourself. I think you learn a lot about yourself through grief. So in some ways, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have things to say about the difference in your practice between using still images, using still photographic images, and moving images, photographic images, and what, just that.
Yeah. Yeah, the difference between sort of still and moving images, it's been a great challenge. I mean, it's totally new for me. In so many ways, it's very similar. You know, you're looking through a lens or composing a picture, and then in a lot of ways, it's so much more complicated. You know, you have 3, 4, 5 minutes to fill, and I'm in the middle of editing this thing. We spend hours, and what I thought was a final edit, I looked at it yesterday and was like, oh no. Like, this is not, you know, and you kind of have to go back and be like, it's too fast. And there's so many, in a way, you have more tools, which is harder, you know, because there are things that I wanted to say through the film. And as I was working with my editor, I was like, well, we could say it through the way in which we frame the shot, or we could say it through the sound, or we could say it through the length of the piece, or we could say through how long we hold this scene. And there's so many more factors to consider, which is exciting and also a puzzle, you know. So there are differences, you know. With the still image, your parameters are much more set.
And do you think there's a reason why you did this as a video as opposed to a series of portraits or photographs?
Yeah. I think part of it was just wanting to try something new. And then part of it was that I saw it in that way. Usually when I see work, for me, it always shows up in a flash. And it shows up in my head, and it shows up, I'm not going to say fully realized because a lot changes in the process, but I see it very visually, very vividly what I want it to look like. And for me, this was like, one day I was running, which is my form of meditation. It was like, this has to be a video, and it has to look like this, and it has to. And then once we started shooting, we changed things. We changed the costumes. We changed the narrative. But I tend to see the final piece almost in a very clear way, and then work backwards from that. And it always ends up somewhere else slightly, but it wanted to be a video from the beginning. I wanted the motion. Yeah. All the way back there. Yeah.
In a similar way without the specific experiences you had at the
high schools you went to. Do you think that your work could exist in this way, or how would it be different if you hadn't gone to photography school? And also, can you talk more about your process in pursuing grant funding?
Yeah, great question. So you were asking, had I gone somewhere else? Did you mean high school or like art school?
Specifically in reference to your comments about technical skills
Mm-hmm.
and your disinterest in technical skills.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, was photography school necessary for
Mm-hmm.
you to be making this art? Do you feel like
I mean,
your high school experience maybe was necessary for this work?
yeah, I mean, the work comes from that high school experience. So if I hadn't experienced that, I don't know what I would be making work about. It would have been something else. A lot of my peers made work that wasn't personal, or I think all work is personal. It wasn't a reflection of their own experiences. Oftentimes it was documentary in nature or took other paths. For me, it has always been very personal. I think if I didn't go to school for photography, would have been maybe these struggles would have come out in a different way, maybe not through art at all. I have to say I had a school that gave me a great technical education. I just chose not to care about it. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question. And then you were asking about grants, and in terms of pursuing grants, I think one thing that has served me a lot has been to find artists that I really respect, whom I feel their career is maybe 5 years ahead of mine, not 20, not even 10, like they're just sort of a little bit more accomplished than I am. They're a little bit older, they've been around a little longer, and that I feel I really admire and I like the path they're taking. And then I go on their website and I study their resumes. And I'm like, oh, they got that grant and that residency and that thing. And it's not the only way I do it, but I find that to be a really great way to find career paths because the artist career path is not written anywhere. You kind of make it up as you go. So I like to kind of look around at people that I really admire, who I feel are where I want to be in 5 years, and look at what opportunities they've pursued, what awards, what grants, and try to pursue those things. And a lot of research, there's a lot of great websites that compile huge lists of grants that are available. And I think the more specific you are, the better. If you can find a grant that really aligns with your identity, that really helps because it kind of narrows the competition. Also, what's the other thing I was going to say? I forgot. I'll remember. But
Can I ask a second
yeah.
part to this one?
Uh-huh.
Can you talk at all about the kind of exploitive nature of marginalized artists,
Mm-hmm.
pursuing those specific hyper specific goals,
Mm-hmm.
and does that ever make it hard to move away from addressing trauma in your work?
Not necessarily. I think I've sat on a lot of panels for different types of grants. I find that there is a lot of bias in the panels that are deciding on those grants. Oftentimes, people on the margins, whether you're a person of color or a queer person or a woman, we're often expected to make work about our identity, whereas others are not. And I find that really problematic. I'm constantly invited to be in queer art shows, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gay, but that's not, it's one piece of what my work is about, but you don't see a show that's a show, of people with blue eyes, or a show of tall people. Why do we have to be defined in those same areas? I do think that grants that are specifically directed at communities that are marginalized, I actually think that's fantastic. I think that is a great way to do something very tangible and very specific to repair some of the injustices and gaps that are in the funding process. To literally say these funds are only going to people of color, they're only going to people with disabilities, or they're only going to queer people. I think it's really great. There's a lot of a lot of foundations that will rotate and make them available to different groups. And I think that's great if you have access to those things. There are so many funds and so many, like, endless amounts of money elsewhere for everybody else. But I do think it's very, very unfair that marginalized people are expected to teach others on how to treat them with respect. So, yeah. One more question, all the way up there. I didn't hear you, I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you ever communicated or told your ex about the art that you did up there?
We never communicated explicitly. My art has been very public and very available on websites, magazines. The story has been told many times, and I know that he has seen it. I certainly know that his husband doesn't like seeing it around, but that's not my problem. We have not talked about it explicitly. When we met once, sort of 10 years later, I think I asked him something similar, and he was like, he was an artist too, so he kind of knows the drill. And he was like, I don't like seeing it, but what am I going to do, you know? So, yeah, that's that. Is that it? Okay, thank you.